Hello, everybody. I am Tony Maciulis. I'm Chief Content Officer of a company called G0 Media, which was founded by political scientist Ian Bremmer. We're a Eurasia Group company. And last year, at this very time, when we were at Paris Peace Forum, we turned, all of us, our collective global gaze to what was going to be the most consequential year of elections in my lifetime, certainly, and really for decades. 2024, when more than half of the world's population was going to the polls in some of the world's biggest democracies, like India, of course, the United States, the EU Parliament, and many, many other countries around the world. And there was a deep and growing concern about generative AI and what role it would potentially play in those elections, and how could it be used potentially nefariously to influence or to interfere with elections. I am joined by my new friend. I'm very happy to have you here, Teresa Hutson, Corporate Vice President for Technology for Fundamental Rights at Microsoft. Part of her purview is exactly this, how technology can be used as a tool to defend democracy around the world. But her purview is actually much bigger than that. And before we dive into the topic at hand, I wanted to give you a chance, Teresa, to talk a little bit about all the projects you're working on and their role at Microsoft.
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, thanks for this conversation. I'm so happy to be here in this beautiful view, beautiful place. I can't believe we're in front of the Eiffel Tower. That's amazing. So yeah, I lead a team called Technology for Fundamental Rights, and we foundationally see our work as making sure that Microsoft is doing the right thing from its own business perspective. So we own the human rights work and make sure that in our business, in the way we deploy, in what we build, and in our supply chain, we're advancing human rights. We also think a lot about extending the benefits of technology. So we think about working on internet connectivity around the world. We started that work in the United States, but we've expanded it to be a global program. And then we make sure our technology is accessible for people with disabilities. And this is a really important moment in time to do that, especially with the advent of generative AI, because there's a lot of opportunity there. And then we spend a lot of our time thinking about how to mitigate potential harms of technology. And that's where our democracy work sits. And we've spent a lot of time over the last year thinking about how to mitigate potential risks of generative AI in the context of elections.
So I want to, of course, focus the bulk of the conversation on looking forward, the lessons learned, and what 2025 will look like. But first, because I don't think everyone knows all the details of what your company and other tech companies did ahead of the election, how did you prepare for 2024? And what were the priorities in looking for where those abnormalities might be?
Great question. So, as ChatGPT sort of burst onto the scene, we heard pretty much everywhere I went, people would say, I'd ask, what are you excited about and what are you worried about in the context of AI? And over again, it didn't matter who I was talking to, people said, we're really worried about generative AI and democracy. Even though people seemed to agree on that, it was about 12 months in and we realized nobody was really doing anything. So last year at the Munich Security Conference, we, with 19 other tech companies, launched the Tech Accord to protect elections. And what this was designed to do was agree as tech companies, it was a set of voluntary commitments that we would build our technology responsibly, we would protect our platforms, and we would undertake societal resilience to make sure that people were ready to deal with anything that came our way.
Yeah, and as part of that, it was an understanding, albeit voluntary, but an understanding among those tech companies that they would identify and call out fake content, deepfakes. There was much consternation about the power of deepfakes in politics and as we were approaching these massive elections. So can I ask you, now looking back on the bulk of them being over with, including some of the biggest, was that the dog that didn't bark?
So I think yes and no. I don't think we saw any deep fake that actually impacted the outcome of an election, with maybe one example in Slovakia, a deepfake that came out within 24 hours of the election during the quiet period in the country. But otherwise, we didn't see anything that was outcome impacting. None of the deepfakes actually kind of really took hold. And I think in part that's because they happen in public, right? And so they can very quickly be debunked. And in fact, every time a deepfake did happen, I actually felt like we were building a little bit of resilience, right? A little bit of public resilience. Every single time somebody would say, oh, this is a deep fake, it's a deep fake. It helped people really recognize that what you saw online could be a deep fake, which actually leads me to the part where I think there is longer term damage done, which is the fact that now the liar's dividend has kind of paid off. And people aren't really sure what they can trust online. And that, I think, is a much bigger problem, especially as information ecosystems get pretty polarized and people go to hear information from people who they agree with. And then you can now say, like, oh, that's not real, that's a deep fake, even about real images. And enough uncertainty has been sort of put into the ecosystem that I think that's the thing we need to contend with next.
So I want to stay on that notion of how it impacts a psychology if it's not actually impacting an election. That trust has been so eroded, and trust in government, trust in the media in a big way. So when you train people to, as your company has, to begin to understand that deepfakes exist and how to spot them, I imagine that that also comes with a feeling inside the consumer, I don't know if this is real or fake. And by the way, it's happening in every corner of society. Unfortunately, I'm thinking it's a much more frivolous example, but you know, Kate Middleton's photo, that suddenly now will probably have everybody thinking twice about anything released by the royal family, right? How do you begin to restore trust? What role does the private sector, particularly obviously tech companies, play in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a role for tech to play, just in terms of things like content credentials and content provenance. So we can attach signals to media so that people can understand where it came from. You can look at metadata, understand if an image has been altered. We can and should label something as AI generated. That is a technology solution. Some of these problems, though, are not technology problems. These are institution problems. And I think there is a reckoning that many of these institutions need to go through, and it's basically every institution. It's business, it's private sector business, it's media, it's higher education, it's government. That we all need to take a look internally and think about what it takes to rebuild trust in our own individual institutions. And it will take some technology solutions, but it's also going to take a lot of transparency, some changing of behavior, that kind of thing. But I do think there is a part of it that technology can help with.
So in the process throughout 2024 of protecting electorates and democracies who were voting, there were also a lot of other learnings. You know, I'm thinking, first of all, of Russia's interference in the Olympics here in Paris as one example. But there were also other societal woes that were brought to light in the course of your work, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think one of the things we learned is that the electorate was one harm group, one group of people that we realized could be impacted by deep fakes. It's not the only one, though. We also know that children are a group of people who can be harmed by deep fakes, that women in public life can be harmed by deep fakes, and consumers. If AI can be used to defraud someone, I had to call my mom and say, I really did do this. Don't ever pay ransom just because somebody's called you in my voice, because that's a real thing. But it did help us really understand how there are different groups that we need to think about. And earlier I said that one of the reasons I think that deepfakes in elections weren't as much of a problem as we anticipated was because it was in public. I actually think that's the bigger challenge with sort of deepfake transmission of women, in sort of exploitative ways or blackmail ways, similarly with children, that we really are going to need to turn our attention to next, societally and as tech companies generally.
That's a really interesting point, because while we were talking before about the difference between meddling with an election result, right, and voting systems, which is one potential problem that we didn't see on any scale. But then there's how you can influence politics by either intimidating people, in this case it's very often gender-based, female politicians who bear the brunt of that kind of online violence, and outcome by perpetrating false information or false narratives. So in terms of that issue, were there enough learnings this year to move into a more protective place in 2025?
I think on the gender point, yes. I think we will move into trying to find places to give women in public life some tools so that they can protect themselves, protect their own images. If there is something posted about them, that they can get it taken down easily. We do see that because women are targeted more often, women politicians are targeted more often than men politicians, and targeted in fairly significantly different ways, both qualitatively and quantitatively, that we will need to take some steps, and our tech companies need to take some steps. We have a responsibility to do a bit more and help with some tools there. In the broader information ecosystem question, I think that it's a multifaceted, multi-stakeholder problem, and it's we talk about whole of society problems. This is absolutely a whole of society problem, and we have to agree it's something we want to figure out together. For me, I think I would start with again, this trust in institutions. Like, how do you rebuild the trusted speakers? Because that's so foundational. If you don't trust anyone, or you only trust the people who think the way you think, that's really problematic for democracy.
And look, I mean, as a member of the media, I mean, I think that it's fair to say there's a lot of blame to go around, and also a lot of work to be done, to your point, across all of these industries. I also want to focus a little bit on the positive, because, and then we'll move to maybe a little bit of a broader point about inclusion, which I know is also within your purview. But in what ways are you seeing examples that AI can be a helpful tool for democracy, and what excites you about its potential applications moving forward?
Yeah, so as a part of our work to, protect the elections this year, we actually trained something like 6,000 or 6,500 people around the world who were in political campaigns or were political candidates. And part of what we were doing was helping them to mitigate the risk of deepfakes, and to help spread the message, but we were also trying to help them use AI technology to advance their own messages. And so one of the most powerful things that AI can do is translate very easily. So if you have a message you want to send, you can translate it into the languages of your constituents. That's pretty powerful, right? And you can do that fairly cheaply and in a pretty easy way. So I think that's there's opportunities there for that to happen. Another place that we've seen AI be really, really helpful is with small local journalism. Local journalists are actually, because they're so cash constrained, they are seeing the opportunity to use AI to do a lot of the work that they can't afford to pay for. It's not the journalism work. It's not the investigative journalism. It's not the writing, but it is translating, or it is summarizing notes from a local school board meeting that you can get. If you have somebody record it, you can then have the AI create. If you don't have a reporter to cover some of those local politics meetings, you can still report on them with the generative AI tools. And so we are seeing small newsrooms and digital-first newsrooms kind of really embrace that as a way of creating a more sustainable business model, which is pretty exciting from a democracy standpoint.
Well, it's certainly nice to hear of a tool for the media that doesn't just put us all out of our jobs, right? So that's helpful. And to your point about translation, I'm thinking of a story out of India that, there are so many dialects spoken there and so many languages spoken in India that it can be impossible, or was impossible, to have government documents like visa applications or permits, real estate papers available to enough people in their own language. And AI is actually helping with those kinds of applications as well, which is really exciting. But this all, of course, presupposes access, that you actually have the tools and know how to use them, right? So a big, big part of what came out of the UN General Assembly and what's been ongoing conversation throughout this past year is, how do we get these tools into the hands of more people? How do we not let the poorest of countries fall further behind as the AI economy emerges? What are your thoughts on that?
It's a great question, and it's one we're thinking about a lot. So, one, there's some foundational things, right? Something like 750 million people in the world still don't have electricity. So AI is like way, way, way down the road. So we have to start with the electricity. We spend a lot of time in my team thinking about connectivity. So how do we extend connectivity around the world? We work with a lot of partners to do that. With all digital literacy, you have skilling needs. But I think with AI and AI adoption, it's going to require us to be very intentional in how we think about diffusing access and then diffusing skills that are used to actually use the AI. We read this book recently inside the company by an author named Jeffrey Ding. He's a political scientist at George Washington University. And, he really talked about what helps a country actually take advantage of a general purpose technology, and it is the diffusion of skills. And that doesn't necessarily mean like higher education skills. It can mean trade skills. It can mean general use skills. Can you use it on a day-to-day basis? And so we're thinking a lot about, what is that skilling framework that we need to make sure that countries are putting forth, so that once you have access to AI, you then know how to use it and then diffuse it throughout your economy so that everybody can take advantage of what we are fairly sure is going to be a significant economic boost to the countries that adopt it.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly, before we open it up to a couple of your questions. Hi, how are you? So many familiar faces. It's great to see you all. When one thinks of AI for good or responsible AI, it does sort of have a connotation of philanthropy, right? But there are really strong commercial reasons for investing in these kinds of developments, right?
Absolutely. First of all, no one's going to adopt something unless it is useful and trustworthy. And so we need it to be both. A lot of what we're doing is making sure it is trustworthy, that people aren't going to invite new technology into their lives if they don't trust it. So beyond that, though, if you think about our accessibility work, we spend a lot of our time making sure that our tools work for people with disabilities. There's like 1 billion people in the world with disabilities, and it's something more and more of us will have as we get older and as the population of the world ages. So the more people who have disabilities who can use our products, the more potential consumers there are of our products. And there's some genuinely life-changing technology. One of my very, very favorites is you will be able to replicate your voice. And so if you lose your voice to a disease like ALS, a degenerative disease, you will be able to continue to talk in your voice through technology when you can no longer talk in your own voice. That's a huge one. But there's also, for neurodiverse people, it helps summarize information so they can process information and participate in the workforce more easily. We can really easily caption movies in ways we couldn't before, so blind and low vision people can experience them. We've done this project with the Rijksmuseum where we're using AI to describe all of the pieces of art in the Rijksmuseum, so blind and low vision people can experience the art. It would have taken years and years and years of manual labor that nobody had the money to do, and now people can just go and experience art in a way that they couldn't before. So this is really, really life-changing stuff that makes me very excited, as you can tell.
Yeah, no, and look, as I learned in Microsoft's Inclusive Tech Lab, audiobooks, which were created for people who are visually impaired, have become one of the biggest businesses, or everybody listens to audiobooks. They're basically like a podcast. So there are many commercial applications. I'd say it's my final point on this before we open up to tie it back to the broader conversation about democracy. Inclusion is also, and access are also important because the growing divide between the richest and the poorest creates geopolitical risk, which ultimately is a political problem that will play out in the polls, hopefully peacefully. And so there are all the more reasons to make sure that we're bridging that divide.
100%.
And I'd love to now open it up to a couple of your questions. I guess we have to put this on. Does anybody want to? Oh, now I can hear myself. Hi. Oh, that
Hi.
might have been helpful all along.
That's weird.
Okay. There we go, right there. Identify yourself, and then
Thank you. Hi, my name is Gal Stern. I'm a student at HEC Paris and HEC Imagine Fellow also, which is a program that supports students from war-torn countries. And I wanted to ask you, how can young professionals starting their career can make sure that they uphold human rights in their job? What tools would you recommend them to use?
It's a really good question. One, I think it's part of the decision you make in picking an employer and finding an employer who you believe is advancing it, and then finding ways to advance your voice in a way that can be heard in a business community. And so, as I said, the thing for us to think about is that our technology is more trusted if we're embedding human rights in it and we're thinking about it that way. That is a business case. If it's more trusted, then more people buy it. And so I think it's super important when if you're working in the private sector, to connect it to the business case in order to advance the goal.
thank you for that question. Anyone else? Oh, back behind. Okay. We need a microphone. And just identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Hanin Zbi. I'm a Tunisian journalist and gender expert, and I would like to know more about the things or the application that you developed to make women protect themselves from the virtual attacks and virtual harassment, because a lot of women that come to us and speak about all the violation that they have on the social media, and the people that are using the AI technology to spread fake news about that.
So we're just sort of at the beginning of developing what we'll do about that. And so we're looking for people to help us understand the problem. So we have a sense of it from people that we've worked with, but we're trying to find the right tools that are helpful and effective. Is it, removing yourself from online searches? Is it asking a platform to take you down, take the a non-consensual sexual imagery down, or whatever it is down? So I think we're kind of at the beginning of that and trying to figure out the right things to do, but certainly welcome thoughts from people who are expert and kind of in the line of fire, so to speak.
I would also add to that that is totally a holistic issue that is going to involve a multi-stakeholder approach, and that includes governments. I mean, there are some governments where the penalties for those kinds of abuses or harassment are very little, if any. And so I think it is going to take a sort of a societal approach rather than just being, an individual sector, for sure. We have time for one more. Anybody? Oh, right there. Okay, terrific. Perfect. You are our last contestant on The Price is Right.
Hello. I am Sai. I am a student studying disruptive technologies at Sciences Po in Paris. I really liked your point about whether it is a tech problem or an institution problem. So I would like to ask, especially when you talk about inclusion and diversity and identifying threats, how can private companies work with governments to solve these issues together? What are your suggestions? Thank you.
So I think there are probably many, many ways that private companies can work with governments, and I think the trick is for each private company to bring what it has and its expertise to bear. So for us, there is a lot of work around closing digital divides, and that can be from a connectivity perspective, from an accessibility perspective, from a gender perspective. But we have to think about it in the context of what we do in our private company, and then work with governments to help bring that perspective to bear, but then also seek their input on what we should be doing more. And I think it's partly government, but it's also academia and civil society. I don't think it's just private sector and government.
Well, thank you, Teresa Hutson. This was amazing. Thank you so much for joining me here. And thanks to all of you for your great questions and your contributions, and all of you who are hopefully watching around the world as we're live from the 2024 Paris Peace Forum. I'm Tony Maciulis. Thanks so much for being here.